We need to lower the cost of doing business. I don't think we should have a corporate income tax. We should be deregulating a lot. We should find ways to reduce taxes for individuals so they can start their own business and be an entrepreneur. That would allow for us to be more affordable here and be more competitive with China and other countries across the globe, instead of saying we're going to tax the imports and hurt consumers here.
Welcome back to another episode of Voices of Liberty. I'm your host, Sean Themea, and today we have a guest who is going to make the case for capitalism. He is the president of Ginn Economic Consulting and the former chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration. We have Vance Ginn, PhD. Vance, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sean. How are you?
Hey, doing fine. Another slightly gray, but yet beautiful day in Austin.
Yes, and we're in Texas. We're not in D.C. or somewhere, so we're not in the swamp.
Or as I like to say, we're not really in Texas. We're in Austin, right?
It's true.
Well, some people, they get annoyed when I say that, but it's the truth.
Yeah. Well, people say, where are you from? I'm near Austin. I try not to claim Austin, the People's Republic of Austin, when I go speak across the country.
Right. People will assume things. That's your perhaps weird, right? As they like to say, keep Austin weird.
Or they're socialists, or they want to raise taxes and those sort of things, which I know we'll get into today. But other than that, we're in a great place in Texas,
Yeah, no, I love a good cup of queso.
Yeah, same here.
So before you were Vance Ginn, chief economist, Vance Ginn, PhD, Vance Ginn, defender of free markets and capitalism, who were you?
Well, that's a good question. I grew up in South Houston in my single mom household with with my sister and everything. And anyway, we grew up pretty poor overall, and I saw a lot about what's going on in the world, this, that, and another. I got in a rock band for a while, so that was fun in Houston. And then I took a class in economics, principles of microeconomics, and it kind of turned me in a whole different direction, along with getting in a bad car accident and other things. And I found my calling, is ultimately what happened, of let people prosper. And so that generated me going to college, being a first generation college graduate, getting a PhD in economics from Texas Tech University, teaching at Sam Houston for a couple of years, State University, and then working at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for about a decade, working on state policy and everything else, and then worked in the Trump White House. So a combination of all these things is that I'm a dad, I'm a Christian, I'm a free market, classical liberal guy who just wants to see people prosper. And the more research that I've done over time and reading a lot of Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, I've come to the realization that it's about liberty. It's about freedom, private property rights. Those are the things that are going to allow us to have the most abundant life possible. And so that really got me on this path to being a defender of free market capitalism.
Yeah, I love the energy. It's clear you're passionate about this subject. And I'm glad somebody is, because there's plenty of people out there who are passionate anti-capitalists.
Yes.
And they've had, I think, the dominant narrative for the last 50 years, which we'll get into. But to the extent you're willing to share, you mentioned being in a rock band, getting in a car accident. I don't regularly associate, hard rock with economics. I mean, did something happen that altered the course of your life?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I was a drummer in that rock band. It was called Syndrome back in the day, in the late 90s. And we were playing a lot of shows, and I was just not living the best life that I could otherwise live in. It was just one day after the next. Am I going to live or die today? I didn't really care. And I got in this really bad car accident where we were going 120 miles per hour down the frontage road in Katy, racing another car, young and stupid. And Suburban came off the exit ramp, came right in our lane. We hit the back end. We kind of nipped him a little bit, and we started rolling about 6 times. I got life-flighted to Herman Hospital, went home that night, really by the grace of God, is the only way I can explain it. All of us did. All of us made it out okay. There were 4 of us in that car. But it gave me a lot of time to think about where my life was heading. I mean, I was bruised up, right? And so I was in bed, thought about this, prayed about it a lot. And I really felt like the direction that I needed to go was education and learning more. And then that came my calling of let people prosper, where I have an addictive personality to begin with, Sean. And instead of being addicted maybe to bad things for a while, I got addicted to learning and studying and that sort of thing. And that really drew me into economics and history and philosophy, and bring all these things together into this kind of, this worldview of what I have today of freedom is essential and is a huge part of not only individually, but for our families and for our communities. And the more the government gets in the way, it oftentimes stifles the benefits that we have in society and the freedom and the liberty that I believe we're created to have.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that out of all the things to get addicted to, you got addicted to learning.
Yes.
And also glad that by the grace of God, all four of you were okay. Because 120 miles an hour, that's no joke.
No.
So glad you're with us. Glad you're unscarred. Tell us more about why you found economics and, free market economics to be so persuasive.
I think it comes down to it made sense. It made sense to me about how the world worked, like learning economics. Learning how people behave within these institutions to satisfy their desires given scarce resources. Many people will think about economics as being, well, it's just the stock market or it's money. And when I would teach classes, I would usually that would be my first question in every class, or not every class, but the first class would be, what is economics? What do y'all think? And usually it would be the stock market, money, something like that. And I said, well, those are all good, but it really is a study of human action and how people are acting and interacting within these social institutions around us. And we have scarce resources that we've got to be able to use them efficiently and effectively. And when you think about it in those terms, it humanizes economics. So now everything that I see around, I can think about in economic terms, which my wife kind of gets on to me sometimes about. But in general, I think it helps explain so much that we see each and every day. And then when you start thinking about, okay, human action, interaction, all these things within economics, you start putting in a third party, like a government, a politician, someone who may have good intentions, but the results of those intentions, as Milton Friedman said, don't judge policy by their intentions, but by their results, is that oftentimes their intentions don't turn into the outcomes that they want. Because people are not, people work with incentives. Pricing mechanisms tells us whether or not we should produce or consume and other things throughout the economy. And when you have too much government, it really impedes on that liberty, that freedom, that voluntary exchange that can otherwise happen in a system like free market capitalism. And that's why I got more and more in that direction compared with, socialism and studying that, communism, which goes along with socialism in a lot of ways, to where you have a lot of top-down control. Whereas I want people to have control, more of a bottom-up approach with very limited government overall.
Yeah. That's great. And I'm curious if you ran into any challenges in your course of your studies and getting your PhD, trying to find work with this worldview, because at least in my experience in undergrad, if you wanted to get the A in the class, then writing in a pro-socialism, mindset, or advocating for more of a Keynesian economy, right? More of a centrally commanded economy. These were the things that were seen as more correct than, say, the free market contrarian view. So did you, in economic terms, assess risk with going all in this pursuit? Did you run into any challenges when trying to find work or complete your degree?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I certainly had a lot of challenges. Not only, I'll get to this in a minute, but not only with the economics and the free market ideas that I had, but also just in the challenges of being a first generation college student and understanding my goal was I got a dual major in accounting and economics, and a minor in political science and mathematics. And so I just wanted to get a bachelor's degree and go work and get a good job. But then when I started getting more into it, my mentor at the time, Dr. Ronald Gilbert at Texas Tech, he was like, hey, have you ever thought about getting your PhD in economics? Because he knew how much I loved it and how much I enjoyed it. And I was like, no, not really. So he said, well, you should apply. So I applied and I got in the PhD program. So I skipped the master's and went straight to the PhD program. But there were a lot of challenges along the way where I just wasn't ready or prepared in that sense. But also because there was so much math. I mean, at Texas Tech, like most PhD programs across the country, are more Keynesian, more mathematical. Unless you go to George Mason or Auburn or somewhere like that, most of them are going to be that way. And what I would do, whether it was an undergrad or graduate school, is I was never shy about putting out my hand Whenever I heard something that I didn't understand or didn't quite agree with, I would put up my hand and ask the teacher hard questions. And I think that's always the best route to learn, is to ask questions. And so even whenever I was teaching, I mean, I would teach it from a free market angle, right? Like the first 15 minutes of every one of my classes, I would do current events and how they applied to whatever we were learning at that time. So there was somewhat of a free market angle, but I tried to be pretty neutral overall. But if they would come and talk to me afterwards, of course, I'm going to have a great conversation then. So it was challenging. And it was also challenging even whenever I had my dissertation committee. There were challenges on, I think there were more political gamesmanship that was playing of trying to keep me out given my views. But eventually I was able to say, you know what, I can do this work. Here's the mathematics. Here is the philosophy. And there was nothing that they could do to stop me at that point from getting my PhD in economics and moving on. And for a long time, Sean, I thought I was going to teach. I love teaching. I think I'm a teacher at heart. My mom was a teacher whenever she was alive. And so I think all those things have really brought together this teaching mentality. Now I'm just doing it in a different way. I have a podcast, the Let People Prosper show, where I can educate people about economics and what's going on through social media. And even talk to experts and learn from them and hopefully expound on what other people can learn who are watching. And then my work at Ginn Economic Consulting, where I work with more than 20 organizations across the country on sort of free market policies. So it's just a different route of teaching, but now I can reach a much broader audience than maybe just in a classroom.
That's great. And that reminds me of the great Ayn Rand quote, right? It's not who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me.
Yeah.
You jumped the gun and was like, well, I'm not even going to let anyone stop me. Right. So, I'm full steam ahead.
Yeah.
So this is great. And, what you shared about speaking up in class, I think is great inspiration for students who might be, scared to share their views.
Yes.
Right? It's just, hey, all it takes is that one bold person speaking out to encourage others to say, hey, maybe I should share my opinion too. Yes. So perhaps you were a domino effect in that sense.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious to talk more about your work in messaging capitalism, messaging free market economics and its merits. You have a thread currently going on X. To paraphrase, is 365 days of help me out. What is it called precisely?
Defense of free market capitalism, basically. 365 days of defending free market capitalism.
That's it. And so every day you post one reason or anecdote as to why capitalism should be defended, which I think, in this type of learning environment where it's micro information everywhere can be extremely helpful for students and really anybody who's looking to be an advocate for liberty. So what are some of your favorite defenses of capitalism that might appear in that thread?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Sean. And it's something I plan to do every day this year. I have so far. And the thing that got me turned on to this, first of all, was not only do I want to defend free market capitalism because I think it's the best institutional framework for an economy for people to prosper and to have liberty, but also because of the growing number of people who find that socialism is the answer. Especially when you look at the younger generations, Generation Z, for example, you're starting to see more of them are susceptible to believing that socialism is better than capitalism. When you look even on Republicans are finding that not as many are as excited about free market capitalism like they used to be. Independence is going down. Democrats is going way down, right? And so I think that there is a need to educate people, which I know Young Americans for Liberty does a great job of. And so I wanted to help with that effort. And so what I try to do is to think about what are the biggest things that we need to learn and what do I see going on each day? And I think the biggest things to your question is private property rights are essential. And if that is not the basis for your economic institutional framework, then you're going to come up with solutions that are going to veer more towards top-down approach and government coming into control. And if government or politicians can control your property, then you really have no freedom. Because then what really can you control within this day-to-day grind that we call life? It makes it very difficult. And so I think that's the biggest part is private property rights, but also our God-given right to liberty and the freedom to be able to worship how you please, to be able to live in a country that's a melting pot and growing, which we could talk about immigration and other types of things. But I think all this stuff comes together beautifully in free market capitalism that you don't find anywhere else. In fact, what you find in systems that have more socialism, which some would say, well, it never existed. Okay, whatever. But what you find is abundance of poverty. You find many people that are unemployed. You find more scarcity, less food, just a lot of negative outcomes that we don't want. Whereas on the flip side with free market capitalism, everything's not perfect, right? The world that we're living in is not perfect, but it provides the incentives in place, like prices, like profits, that allows for people to improve. But do you know what just as important in free market capitalism that I try to bring up often is not just the profits, but the losses. And in socialism, there's this argument that you don't need to lose, that everybody can be made better off over time. But the problem is when you do that, you breed mediocrity. You breed poverty-ridden results because no one knows best. Like Hayek said, right? We have this knowledge problem. No one has all that available information. So why not allow people in the marketplace to do it over politicians who are just a few, and they have a lot of incentives that are different than those in the marketplace because they got to get reelected and get lobbying funds and everything else. And so I think those are the types of things that I hope to get across over these 365 days of defending free market capitalism.
Yeah, so many different things to unpack and explore there. But one thing you brought up was the concept of profit. And now profit, at least in the university context and the mainstream, it's a dirty word. You know, you see the catchphrase, people over profits pretty frequently. Now you have made, some would say, a bold statement that profits are proof that you've helped someone, right? I think I saw that in your thread. So tell us more about what that means.
Yes. So profit, to your point, right? Profit tells us that you've helped someone, because if not, then you wouldn't profit, right? We only exchange voluntarily if we're both going to benefit from that exchange, or we don't do it. One of the things that Lloyd von Mises and other great economists have talked about is at the margin, right? Do we exchange or not? So I have dollars or in my pocket, I have money. It's currency in my pocket. Am I willing to give that up? And that should include not only my direct cost of losing that dollar, but also the indirect, the opportunity costs. And those are associated in every one of our decisions. Many people who are hopefully watching may not even know a lot about economics, but they're thinking economically in some sense every day. Do I do this at this time or this at this time? Because time is scarce. We need to know how we're going to allocate those resources. And the same thing goes when we want to exchange. It's very difficult for us to produce everything that we want every day. Our food, our water bottle, our clothes, all those sort of things. But if I can do something that I'm good at doing in my comparative advantage, if you think about it in that concept of David Ricardo, then I want to teach about economics. Well, somebody else may need something that I want, maybe more services around my house. Now we come up with an exchange. And when that happens, we both profit. I'm profiting because I get something, maybe my yard mowed or something like that at my house. And the person that I'm paying now gets money to go buy something that they want to buy. And that brings a system that allows for people to learn and improve over time. Because without those profits, with just saying, you know what, we're going to have this exchange, we're not really going to both improve, one of us is losing, it's a zero-sum game, that system fails very quickly because it reduces the incentive to innovate and have ingenuity and really bring about new ideas. And that's how countries historically have always failed. If you look at ancient Rome, one of the reasons why that they failed when they did, there's a lot of explanations for this, but my view on this is that they internalized. They stopped trading with the outside world. And when they did that, it became a situation, I'm not talking about militarily, I'm talking about they just stopped trading altogether outside. And that created the downfall of Rome that had existed for, 800, 900 years. And I don't want that, I don't want to see that in America. In fact, I don't want to see it anywhere across the globe. I want all people to prosper. And so this kind of gets me sometimes in, some rough waters with folks who are say, well, we need to limit all trade or have protectionism, right? Or even immigration. I believe in legal immigration. We need more of it because we need more people to be able to prosper. And so if you think about this from a top-down approach, it stifles, it constrains the otherwise abundance that we could have.
You know, you mentioned Rome, you know, oceans rise, empires fall, but maybe they don't have to if they just embrace free markets and capitalism, some might say. You mentioned earlier, you know, private property and, you know, defense of free markets and capitalism because it enshrines the right to private property, or at least they're very closely correlated. I think perhaps for a lot of people, that's something that in America we take for granted. Can you think of historical examples of, hey, this society did not have private property rights and bad things happened? What comes to mind?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind was Russia. Vladimir, Lenin back in the day. There was no private property rights. And so it made it less likely that you want to build anything or come up with something new. We have a lot of these issues in China right now as well. Private property rights are not something that they cherish. And when you think about these sort of economies and societies, they typically fail, or there's massive starvation, famine, things of that nature. And I think when we look back at these different experiences, Dr. Peter Bedke at George Mason University, one of my mentors, he wrote a lot about Russia. That's why it's the first thing that came to mind, of how during that time, Vladimir Lenin had this massive populist messaging to get people on his side, because you need people on your side to some extent to gain that power. But then there was okay, it's communal, right? These are communal sort of property that's out there. It doesn't belong to an individual. It's belonging to us, or the state is what they like to call it. But as soon as that happens, you take away the incentives for people to profit, going back to that again, but also to improve whatever that property is over time. And that's why you start to see everything starts to crumble. You can't defend yourself as a country. You know, it makes it because you don't have any revenue that's coming in if you stop producing as much. And so even militarily, you start to crater. You start to become very fragile in that sort of situation. And so, you know, I think that there are very few reasons for government. National defense is usually up there for me, because I think it's difficult for private associations to come together. Or if private militias fight, then one of them is likely going to win. Then it becomes a larger militia, and they tend to take over. So maybe some national defense. Contract law, like a justice system, I think is important, one that's impartial. And then maybe a few public goods, but it's nothing like the America that we had today. I think we're much more socialist in many ways than what we should be. And especially not like many of these other countries that have failed over time and become, you know, basket cases in a lot of ways of not allowing for more economic growth and innovation. I think it's one of the reasons why America is leading with about 340 million people compared to a place like China that has 1.4 billion. Sure, they get some things right here and there, but you have 4 times the population. You would hope you would. I think they would be much more, I know they would be much more prosperous as a society and per capita in China if they were able to embrace free market capitalism. And one point of evidence to that is that in 1978, 79, you had this Chinese Revolution where they started to allow for more free market capitalism. Some markets were able to expand, have some competition, not just these big monopolies by government. And during that period from 1978, 79, around the mid 2000s, early 2010, the aughts, China really expanded a lot. But then President Xi came in and started to clamp down, and we started to see that go backwards. So I think it gives us some evidence of free market capitalism really working in a place that didn't have much to begin with. The other place, though, that I do a lot of my work, Sean, is in the states. So the states that tend to be more economically free also tend to be the most prosperous and the place where people move. A big thing about economics is that people move with their feet. If they don't like where they're at, they move, they change their position. And what better way to do that than just moving to a different state if you can't move to a different country? And so I think we have plenty of examples to highlight this.
Yeah, and you know, whether it's moving from state to state in the US, or, you know, getting on a boat and risking your life to flee a communist country, a command economy country, to come to a capitalist country, right? People are certainly moving with their feet, and you usually don't see it the other way around, except maybe if you're, you know, George Clooney or a very wealthy liberal celebrity that can afford, you know, to make that move. I want to talk more about the states later, but, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, the average Gen Z and now upcoming Gen Alpha kids, and they're the first generation in the last several generations who are saying, man, I might be worse off than the generation before me. I can't reasonably foresee how I'm going to ever own a home. And the universities and mainstream are telling them, well, that's because of capitalism, right? How would you respond?
Yeah, it's a big thing. It's something I've been writing about a lot actually lately, and talking about this affordability crisis that's been going on. The first thing I usually say is that we need to understand kind of who the culprit is here. It's not the profiteers or greedy corporations or institutional investors has been a big thing here lately in the housing market. It's government. Government is the problem. And oftentimes, if you try to correct a government problem with more government, you get bigger government failures. And that's what I've been trying to avoid right now. And so what I try to help folks to realize is what is creating like a lot of the housing affordability issues. Well, one thing we gotta look at is the Federal Reserve. The Central Bank of the United States has kept interest rates too low for too long during the last decade. There's around 0%, and that incentivized a lot of people to buy cheaper mortgages because the interest rates are lower than otherwise. And if demand exceeds the supply, prices are going to go up. And along with that, though, you have a lot of other zoning restrictions that are usually at the local level. You have property taxes that can influence that as well, that are at the local level. And so it comes through with a lot of the excessive government spending and regulations on housing and many other areas that we buy that creates a affordability crisis like we have today. And so what I would suggest for those who are really trying to move into and own a home is, first of all, make sure that you're politically aware and economically have a good economic understanding of what's going on to fight back some of these big regulations, these big spending items, the excessive amount of government intervention in that market to begin with, before we can start to see, okay, what is actually going on in this marketplace? And I know that seems a little bit esoteric, a little bit outside of the realm, but I really do believe that once we start doing that and advocating like Gal does and others out there, then we will be in a better situation in the future to allow for more free market capitalism to where housing is more affordable. Sean, some great examples here recently is even in Austin, the People's Republic of Austin, right? They had some deregulation of housing a couple of years ago on their zoning. They removed some of the zoning restrictions. And what we've seen since then is that there's been more housing being built and the prices are coming down a little bit. Still maybe unaffordable for a lot of folks who are just starting out. But I think that it provides at least some insight that even in a place like Austin, you can have some benefits. And then you look down the street where I grew up in Houston. Houston has very little zoning restrictions. And that the values there, the home prices there are much lower than any of the other major cities. I mean, that's like the top 3 or 4 city in the country as far as population goes. And so why shouldn't it be as expensive to live there as Los Angeles or New York? Probably could be, or Chicago. It's because of, and I believe this is because of the deregulationary environment that's in Texas to begin with. No personal income tax, I think, is also very helpful. But then even at the local level, Houston, with all of its warts and everything else, has done a good job of not trying to restrict the amount of housing supply. So I think this really comes down to a supply issue on the housing side. And then if we wanted to get deeper into it, there's also a lot of artificial demand from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, from giving out a lot of loans, from the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates too low and having a $6.5 trillion balance sheet where a lot of that are mortgage-backed securities. So they purchase, they increase the price, reduce the rates on those mortgage-backed securities, which affects all of our mortgage rates, which sounds good, Sean. It's one of those good intentions of keeping rates low. But the result is that you get unaffordable housing across the country.
Yeah. And what you said about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, right, reminds me of the higher education cartel as well, and student loans. And the reason that college is so expensive is they are giving out loans so much that the colleges are saying, hey, well, we can raise the tuition because the loans are just going to cover it. The government's going to back it up. And, the administrations, they get bloated because they have all this extra money. So very similar cause and effect. And overall, what I'm hearing is, we have an affordability crisis, not because of capitalism, but because government is not the solution, it's the problem.
Correct.
And if you had to distill, if you're in the closing door of an elevator and someone says, quick, why should I believe in this dirty word of capitalism? Why should I believe that this is better than, say, socialism or other forms of economy, right? If in 10 seconds, how would you make that case?
Capitalism allows for profit to go to those who need it most. And which system doesn't build off profit? All of them have some form of profit. So why not allow for people to prosper in the process? And that's free market capitalism.
Awesome. And then the elevator door shut and the person changed their mind for the better.
I hope so. I hope so.
This hypothetical person, guy, gal, whomever. Let's go back to talking about the states, right? You had alluded to people voting with their feet, moving to states that have greater levels of economic freedom. We see, California and New York, their population is decreasing because they're moving to places like Florida and Texas, which, is more affordable to own a home in. There's no income tax. But if I may not just give Republican states or red states, a full pass, there's plenty of work to still be done. And now you may not have seen the news, but very recently, the Wyoming Senate, which is supermajority Republican, overwhelmingly just voted against repealing the property tax out there. And there's plenty of states that have Republican leadership that are quote unquote freedom states that still have income taxes, right? And they still have all of these, restrictions on economic freedom. So why do you think the party of limited government and free market economics allegedly seems to get in the way of some would call radical changes like abolishing income tax or abolishing property tax? Yeah.
Oh man, there's a lot to that. This is a great question. I think the Republicans, to stick on that just for a minute, there's a split that's happening among those who are more free market oriented and those who maybe are more open to more government. And I think that has kind of hurt their side of pushing free market capitalism as much as otherwise. In fact, some of them are even calling out capitalism as being bad. And this is something I think is really hurting. So if you think about the states and what they're doing, and I like the push. As you know, Sean, I've been long for eliminating property taxes. I don't think that the government should have a right to take away your property. Going back to the essential part of property rights of capitalism, I don't think they should be able to take your property. And so therefore, there should not be a property tax. I'd rather there be more of a sales tax oriented system to where I keep all my income, I keep all my property, but if I want to buy something, I'll pay you a tax or I can save it and get around it. I think all of them are bad. All taxes are bad. They're theft, right? Taxation is theft.
People are saying. Yeah.
Right. But some are quote unquote better. Let me put it this way, less burdensome than others. And I think that's where the sales tax comes in. And what I've also seen though, in like Wyoming, you brought that up because I've done some work with Wyoming. I wrote a paper on here's a path to eliminating property taxes. One of the things that I think has been hurting that argument is there's not really a bold path forward on what to do. They just come out and say, they put on the constitutional amendment that they go and vote on. It just says elimination of property taxes, but not a way to replace it, either by cutting spending or another form of taxation. And I think people are fearful of that. Like, okay, well, what happens to my roads? What happens to the schools? And if you don't have an answer, it makes it very difficult. I think that, Governor DeSantis in Florida has been doing a good job of saying, look, we need to do something about property taxes. But it's also, they don't really have a good plan yet either on what's going to happen. So I'm worried that what that's going to do. And even in Texas, when I was at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I worked on this, and Governor Abbott, if you through a different forms of different elections, he's talked about eliminating property taxes. He has a plan now talking about property taxes. So there's been this push, but I think the boldness is what I'm feeling is what the red states are fearing. Like there's a good talk, there's a lot of talk, but not the actions to back it up. And what I'm also concerned about though, like in Texas, you brought up Texas, done a lot of research on Texas, of course, and just over the last two budget cycles, the state budget is up 42%. So look at just state funds up 42%. Well, you say, okay, but we had the inflation during Biden years and all that. So how would that compare to population growth plus inflation? Population growth plus inflation is up 23%. So the budget is up almost twice as fast. And so what my concern has been is not only property taxes and other things, but we've got to get our fiscal houses in order, even in red states. The blue states are way out. They're much worse in California, New York, and things of that nature. So sure, the red states are better, but I think there's a next step that we need to go to say, why are we spending so much money? Why is the budget in Texas $250 billion for a 2-year budget cycle, $120, $130 billion per year? That's massive. And if we're going to spend that much money, what are the results? So education outcomes keep going down or have stayed stagnant, even as we've spent more and more in that education over time. Our roads still have potholes. How much more money do we need to spend there? And I think that's something that maybe we're missing some on the more libertarian conservative side, and especially in these red states, is that it's almost become budget inertia to where they say, this is what we spent last time, so we just need to keep spending on it. And instead, what I would suggest is we need to really think about, how are we supporting a vibrant economy and a vibrant people by getting out of the way and allow for the dynamism of free market capitalism to work?
Yeah. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of fear, I think, more so from maybe cutting spending even than the loss of tax revenue. I don't think anybody is staying up at night unless you're a professional bureaucrat saying, oh, I'm really scared about losing tax revenue. But the average person, when they hear government program getting cut, right? There's a sense of fear. There's a sense of loss. There's a how can we function without that? And what we're hearing from you is there needs to be a better case made for, no, this is how we will thrive without that, right? This is how the community might step up and fill that function better, right? And one thing that comes to mind, and again, our viewers can Google this, but something about dominoes filling the potholes better, or plowing the snow better than the government. We'll drop that link in the comments maybe. But what comes to mind for you of how we can message better about, look, we need to cut taxes, we need to cut spending, things will be better. Someone says, prove it. What examples can you point to?
Yeah. The first thing I would point to is that it allows for people, individuals in the private market, to have more money in their pocket, to have more freedom to do what they're going to do. And I trust people in markets, the millions of people and everything else, than I do of politicians and bureaucrats. And the more that you hand over the power through more government spending, more taxes, and more regulations to politicians and bureaucrats, who gets less? The people. And so, as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, which is what economics is a lot about. Or what are the trade-offs on all of those scarce things like time? What are you giving up? Like us doing this now, what else could we be doing? That's our opportunity cost. And there's a lot that's given up when the government steps in to fill these voids where I would privatize a lot of roads. I think we need more private schooling versus the abundance of government schooling that's out there today. I mean, you kind of go through the list. There's a lot of things that we've got to work on. And unfortunately, once you get ingrained, I mean, look, when I was working in the Trump White House in the first administration from June 2019 to May of 2020, there were a lot of people who were working on deregulation with Russ Vode and others, who's the director now as well. And I think but there were also a lot of people who said, well, we can't do that because the federal government needs to be involved. And I would ask, well, why? So maybe, just maybe, a path forward for us to better message is to say, look, we have examples of what's worked well when you allow for more school choice, for example. The grades, the outcomes for students tend to improve across the board. Those who are in public or government schools and a private school, homeschool, they all tend to improve. Why wouldn't we want that?
Yeah.
And also, maybe it goes back to our conversation earlier though, Sean, is why don't we ask more questions? Like, okay, you're saying that we need more spending. Well, why? Maybe put it back on them a little bit to where we're not always having to explain. Why don't we try to be on the offense and to say, you need to explain why you need another dollar, or if you even need $1 to begin with. And in budgeting terms, we call that zero-based budgeting, to where you start at zero and kind of work your way up. And there's some of that's been done in Texas and some other states. I would think they should do it better. But I think the big question here is, why free market capitalism? Or why do we need government in this at all? And oftentimes I think we'll find that we don't need government. We just need people and markets working together. And some would say too, Sean, that, well, yeah, but that's going to be out of control. That's going to be our anarchy. That's going to be insanity. But markets, just like people, are, we work spontaneously. So it may not always be beautiful. It could look a little disorganized. But the prices, the profit and loss system that we talked about earlier, that's what can allow for the regulating, quote unquote, regulating of the economy versus a top-down government regulation.
Yeah. No, that's great stuff. I want to talk about your experience in the administration, right? As chief economist of the first Trump administration in the Office of Management and Budget. Tell us about some of the free market progress that you tried to make there and what challenges you may have run into.
Yeah. The biggest thing I think that I was able to help with and that we were able to do was on the deregulation side. President Trump had come in, the first administration, say we're going to get rid of, for every one new regulation, we're going to get rid of 2. Well, it ended up being 7. And for every new one, we gave up 7. And that saved hundreds of billions of dollars a year in regulatory cost that I think puts more power in the hands of consumers, in the hands of entrepreneurs. That's where we want it to be. And so I think that was a huge success. I think also in President Trump's last budget was for fiscal year 21. I helped find $4.6 trillion in savings. Now that's over a decade. And it's the Washington talk that, it's not a cut because it's just less than it otherwise would have been spending. But there were savings that we're able to find. And even in his last budget, I was able to get in there about a spending limit based on population growth and inflation that hadn't been in any president's budget. I went and looked back, except for during the Reagan years. They talked about spending limits. And so those were some things that I was really happy about. Some frustrations, to be honest, was that there were still too many people that were wanting bigger government, whether that be through trade protectionism and tariffs, whether that be through immigration sort of policies over coming up with a more market-based visa system is what I would have liked to see. And the other one too was really looking at what happened during COVID. I mean, you had COVID, you had the shutdowns. I mean, ultimately, Sean, that's why I ended up leaving, is because of the direction that I saw things were going. And I don't put it all necessarily on President Trump at the time, but there was a lot of feedback from Fauci and Birx and others that were wanting to shift us more towards a closure sort of system. And I kept writing internally saying, no, this is bad. We may not know what all is going to happen with this pandemic and with COVID-19, but we do have examples of what's happened in the past. So why not use some of those for one thing? But also the opportunity costs are too high. The more that we put people on the sidelines of entrepreneurs, the fewer breakthroughs we're going to have to overcome this sickness and allow for people to prosper. Whereas when we went through the 30 days or 15 days to stop the spread and it ended up being months, in Texas, we didn't fully open for another year later. I mean, I think it all started, unfortunately, at the White House. And I tried to push back as much as possible. I think I'm hopeful that there were some good things done during that period. But it was something that really, it still frustrates me to this day of what that whole situation looked like.
Yeah. And again, every government law will be defended to the fullest extent of the law, should it be pressed.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Texas, you remember Shelley Luther, right, who said, hey, I'm going to keep my salon open, right? My hairdressers, they need to put food on the table to feed their families. And if people don't want to come, that's fine, but we're going to be open. Yeah. And she ended up spending a couple nights in jail in, the heart of deep red Texas, where freedom's supposed to reign. Of course, now she's in the legislature and making a bigger impact. So awesome to see that. But yeah, what would your ideal policy look like when COVID had rolled out, right? Instead of the way things went, how should it have went? What role should the government have had, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I've long thought about and prayed about, and I've learned a lot since that time. What I was pushing at the time, even in DC and here in Texas, is that if the government's going to get involved, and we can hassle whether or not they should have at all, but it should have been a more targeted approach to help those who were immunocompromised, that were the elderly. I mean, those are the ones that were getting sick and dying the most, with COVID, from all that sort of discussion. But those are the demographic of the population that I think that could or should have gotten more resources relative to it being a blanket lockdown to where everybody's staying home, because there were opportunity costs with that. Because now more people are in tight areas, breathing on each other. So they were bringing it home and infecting everyone. And so, there were opportunity costs with that as well. And so what I would have rather have seen is that let's get the PPE, remember all the stuff that we needed at that time, to the places that you need it most. And I think government could have helped facilitate that. But otherwise, leave the economy open. And two, let's say if you did get sick, then you just stay home from work. For many people, this was a bad flu and they weren't going to end up in the hospital or anything else. Or if you did, you were going to come home and you're going to be okay afterwards. And so I think it would have been a much more reasonable situation to where the government could provide information. I think we did some of that at the White House, right? Remember those daily news press conferences and everything else. But the problem became all the mandates and forcing closures of businesses that never reopened. And then the amount of government spending. I mean, we increased the national debt, I think, or the deficit that year by like nearly $4 trillion.
Yeah.
Just a massive amount.
Printed a ton of money. Too, right? And what happens when there's too much, money in circulation? Right? What happens? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And distortions in the housing market.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the types of things that I think would have been put us in a much better situation, not only then to help people, and I still don't think we would have hit the 2 million, number of lives lost or anything, but also longer term. It's not just in the short run, but we have to think over time. How does this affect our kids? The learning loss that we've found of kids not going to a school, whether it be private school or public, was huge during that time. Now, it also helped to generate maybe the school choice revolution that otherwise may not have existed, because now parents got to see, okay, what are my kids actually learning or not learning? And what are they doing so long? Well, I don't know if I like that very much. And started asking questions, going to the question part again. And so I'm hopeful. I pray that we've learned from this experience and that we'll do it differently next time.
Next time?
Yeah.
You're saying they're planning another one?
I hope not.
Inside intel? I don't know. You got to share that with the class. If so, yeah, I know. Forced masking of kids, horrible. Forced virtual learning of kids, horrible.
Yeah.
Let the record show, Young Americans for Liberty, right? We were back in the office early May. Never a mask mandate, never a vax mandate.
Nice.
Unfortunately, we got to live very normally, right? Which was not the case for many people in the workplace. What are some of the biggest opportunities that you see right now, policy-wise, to advance economic freedom? And also, what are some of the most dangerous, possibilities on the horizon that we should be, shouting against?
Okay. If I could, let me start with the bad ones first.
Yeah, sure.
That we can go to some of the optimistic. The big things that I see right now, when I think about an economic growth and free market capitalism, property and all that, right? What you need are labor and you need capital and productivity for an economy to grow. And in order to do that, you need to have exchanges that can take place. That we talked about earlier, voluntary exchange. You need to know what the rules of the game are, which we can have limited government contract law and stuff like that. But something I think that's really is struggling for me right now to find out like where this is all going to end up. I don't know what the end game is going to be, is on trade and the protectionism and the tariffs and everything else that's going. Let's not talk even about the unconstitutional aspect of it from a president doing as much as what President Trump has done, but even Biden did this a lot too. It's removing that profit and loss from not only the 340 million people in America, but the 8 billion people across the globe. So if we want to really expand, and I'm for letting, like I said earlier, let people prosper, not just Americans, which I'm American, right? But I really want everyone to prosper, Sean. And I think the less of trade that we have with other people in other countries, the worse off we're going to be and the worse off they're going to be. Because remember, China doesn't trade with America. Countries don't trade. People trade. And they only trade when they mutually benefit from those exchanges. Now, someone could argue, well, yeah, but China has these other types of restrictions, or they don't play by the same rules of the game. That's often what we hear. But what I like to do is to say, instead of pointing that one finger at China, I've got 3 fingers pointing back at me. So what can I do? What can we as America do to be more competitive? Well, we need to lower the cost of doing business. I don't think we should have a corporate income tax. We should be deregulating a lot. We should find ways to reduce taxes for individuals so they can start their own business and be an entrepreneur. That would allow for us to be more affordable here and be more competitive with China and other countries across the globe, instead of saying we're going to tax the imports and hurt consumers here. So I think that is going to have a ripple effect for many years throughout our economy if we can get that right. The other big one, which is another hot topic right now, Sean, is on immigration. Like, I also want people to be able to go to places like we talked about earlier of moving with your feet. Let people move with their feet to where they're going to prosper. And I think most people that come to America who are immigrating from another country are doing so because they want to prosper. They want to benefit us just like we want to benefit them. And it's become too much about, well, they're just from a foreign country. And that's something else I think is really going to hinder our growth here in America and across the globe if we don't find a better way. I don't like illegal immigration just because it puts a lot of things in the underground economy. So if we're not going to have illegal immigration, which there's probably always going to be some of that, but why not have a better functioning legal immigration system? To where if you want to be here to work for a while, you should be able to get that. And that there should be prices to pay. I think that an auction market on this is what Richard Vedder has talked a lot about, and Gary Becker and others in the economic realm. There is a market-based approach that can allow this to happen. But if you look at the capital that happens from international trade, and you look at the labor from immigration, I think those two areas are really concerning to me about the current situation that we're in, that will really stifle our economic growth over time. Because although people will say, well, trade or immigration, they hurt Americans, I think that's wrong. I think it's actually a more constrained scarcity view versus the growth and abundance view. Because as you have more trade, you can now produce more, you can buy more, and maybe even at a cheaper rate. And if you have more people, you could also have more opportunities for people to work and find more opportunities for there to be growth and profitability. And all that centers around what can we do? This is the part on the more optimism, is I'm hopeful that we can find ways to bring our fiscal house in order, to do something about the Federal Reserve. I mean, I want to end the Fed, as I know Yal does. But if we're not going to get there, what kind of limitations can we put on the Fed as much as possible? And so I'm for strict rules, whether it be on the budget, on limited spending, and on the amount of the balance sheet that the Federal Reserve has. We need more rules on government. Lock them in. We need lockdowns of government from growing so much, not on people and the entrepreneurs that they are to profit. And if we do that, we would go back to free market capitalism, because that's really what more of this is about. We'll be in a much more prosperous situation.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of my tax dollars going toward an expansion of the unchecked surveillance state, right? And $50,000 bonuses to hire government employees, right? Which is what we're seeing with the expansion of the Department of Homeland Security on the immigration issue. But on tariffs, I think this is where the, pro-capitalism argument is really necessary, because you're striking an issue of fairness when it comes to the tariffs, right? People hear, hey, we're getting ripped off. People don't like feeling like they're getting ripped off. You also hear the argument of, hey, these tariffs are leverage for the other countries to behave geopolitically how we want, right? And I think admin is messaging that pretty strongly on those victories that they're claiming. And thirdly, now you have this claim as well of, look at all this revenue coming in, right? We might eliminate the national income tax, all this tariff revenue, right? So I think that admin is doing a lot to get that messaging out there. Would you dispute that either that's happening as they're claiming, or that it will be as effective as they're claiming?
It's one of the things that I've been shocked, right, of how many Republicans have been in favor of raising taxes. Because that's what tariffs are. They're a tax on imports. And so now they're saying they're going to raise $3 to $4 trillion over a decade, because they started off with saying this was going to be temporary, right? These are a negotiating tool to have leverage, just as you put it, Sean, of bringing the other side to the table, and then we can get an outcome that we want. The problem is that they're doing that on the backs of Americans. They're raising taxes on us, and at the same time saying that they're going to reduce the deficit or have an ability to eliminate the income tax, which I'll come back to, because we're going to get $4 trillion in new revenue over the next decade. Well, that assumes that it's going to stay in place for a decade. So this is not temporary. This is a longer term scheme for them to be able to bring in new taxes to try to correct what they feel as imbalances in the global economy within trade. I still think it goes back to, we've done ourselves a disservice and we've pushed companies to move away, whether that be too strong of unions, whether that be state and local and federal tax and spending and regulatory policy, or something else, that we should be doing more here to reduce the cost of doing business versus pushing it elsewhere. But even with that, what have been the results? The trade deficit continues to expand. It was higher this year than it was last year. So even with all the increase in tariffs and the Liberation Day tariffs on April 1st that Trump put in place of 2025, that hasn't resulted in the outcomes that they expected. And in fact, what it does is it distorts each market and it slows down economic activity than we otherwise would have. And so I'm worried about that sort of situation of continuing to go down that route, saying that other countries are taking advantage of us or feeling fair, because we only have control over what we do here in this country. I also don't necessarily like the idea that we can use tariffs as a way to, as leverage to get certain outcomes with another country when there's better ways. There's dialogue, there's diplomacy, there's strengthening of maybe our military here in America to protect our borders, where Ron Paul always talked about that. Like, let's make sure we have strong defense here. Why are we in so many other places spending all this money? That doesn't make any sense. And so I think going back to all this though, is how did Trump get down this route? He was able to tap into what people are feeling, to your point, is that they felt like we were getting taken advantage of and all these other things. And I would argue that we were being sold on the wrong economics. We were being sold that this is a result of international trade instead of the benefits of trade, the benefits of free market capitalism. And so that's why I'm trying to do doing this 365 days this year of defending free market capitalism, because it wasn't capitalism that did this. It was more of a socialism trend. It was higher cost of doing business at home that then pushed people to move elsewhere. Businesses, when you talk to them, their first goal is not to go out and say, I'm going to leave America to go to China, where they're probably going to lose their intellectual property and other things when they go there, have to pay more in taxes and all this other nonsense. They'd rather be here. But what it tells me is that the cost of doing business are so high here that it makes it difficult for them to profit and they want to go somewhere else. And I can hear the retort being, well, but why should they be in the business of profiting? And this goes back to my point earlier.
Or like, are you a real patriot if you ever leave? You know,
I know.
99% taxes, you're not a patriot if you don't stay.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's been a struggle right now. I think we have this illiteracy, economic illiteracy, that we've got to get back to the fundamentals. Last year, I talked a lot about Econ 101, getting back to the basics in economics. That's kind of where this started on the defending free market capitalism, because I do see this as being such a major issue.
Yeah. Vance, we're coming to the end of our time here. So if you could give one piece of advice for people who want to get more involved in standing up in defense of free market capitalism, who want to get involved in the liberty movement, take that first big step, what would you say to them?
Yeah, first of all, Sean, thank you for having me here, and good luck with the podcast and everything. I hope it goes really well. And great work that Young Americans for Liberty has been doing for decades now, many years, and continue to do. For the audience, I think just getting more involved with groups like YAL by asking more questions like we've talked about today. Check out my work at vanceginn.com, and I have a Substack newsletter and my Let People Prosper show and all that. I mean, I think by going down that route and educating yourself on the benefits of free market capitalism, the costs of socialism, just education in general, and being a lifetime learner, I think are essential for the next steps for us to be more prosperous and to really having a better idea of what America is about and about what the future of liberty is going to be, is if we're better educated. And I'm hopeful that you, I, and many others will be a part of that process.
Awesome. Well, as in sales, they say always be closing, and Vance for Liberty says always be learning. So,
yes.
Excellent stuff. Vance Ginn, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being with us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to Voices of Liberty on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or YouTube. And to learn more about how you can be a part of the movement advancing freedom in our lifetime, visit yaliberty.org. I'm Sean Themea, and thank you for listening to Voices of Liberty, where we keep the torch of liberty burning by telling the stories of those who carry it forward. See you next time.